Hello everybody, my name is Mercedes and I'll be taking us through the coercion and its fallout chapter 3, Ivory Laboratory or Glass House. So with my summary, I just broke it up into the mini headers that are within the chapter, and there are 3. So the first one is, can conduct be analyzed? And overall, it went on to explain that coercion is basically everywhere in all of our daily lives, and it can hurt us the most when we are doing them unknowingly. Behavior analysis deals with the management of our own conduct and those of others. And we try to meet the world halfway by adjusting ourselves, and that's what we as behavior analysts hope to study. There are 2 methods that Sidman went on to discuss to changing a behavior. One is formal education, and the example he used was when it comes to teachers whose goal and job it is to change and teach new behaviors every day. And a successful teacher is determined to be one who is changing a student's behavior in ways that demonstrate their new learned skills and capabilities. And that's what we want kids to learn in formal education. We want them to learn those skills needed for survival. And the second way to change a behavior, it occurs in the code of law. And laws are basically contingencies that if you act a certain way, a certain consequence will follow. And that's the same throughout. And he goes on to say that the sense of behavior will not save humanity, but it can teach us how to live and best use our resources and our time to analyze ourselves. And with the research in this field, it's been determined that delayed consequences affect conduct weakly. And to answer the question of this header, can conduct be analyzed? I agreed that yes, it can be analyzed. It's just going about it in the right way when you go and make an experiment. Which brings us into the second header, which is, what does it mean to do an experiment? And on this section, it tells us what an experiment is and what it isn't. An experiment is not a test to see if what you think is going to work or if your idea is going to be true, and you only work things out to get that to serve your own purpose. An experiment is compiling data and using techniques that will make it easy for the public to understand what you concluded, and it will explain exactly how something occurred and the conditions that allowed for replication, and then how to do it behaviorally. First, you have to define the behavior, specify the measurements, define the procedures, describe test conditions, report the methods of measurement and the reliability of the measurements, and then finally report and discuss possible influences to the data that could have swayed it one way or another. A lab, and then, like with this chapter, it's called Ivory Laboratory or Glass House, and it's explained that a lab is an important place because it keeps all changes in the experimental conditions relevant to just the question that's being asked. And it allows us to alter the environment in one single way, and then we can also return it back to normal when we feel like doing it. And it allows us to see actual causal relationships under a controlled setting and not out in the world where so many influences can make something change, or any extraneous variables. A lab doesn't necessarily replicate the real world to its T, but that's its purpose. It's not supposed to replicate it. It's going to deal with only the relevant parts of life of the question we're asking, and then we will apply it to real life. And a little blurb in the chapter also ties the chapter back to the title, Ivory Laboratory or Glass House. And it goes on to state that the lab used to be an ivory tower, but now an ivory tower with thick walls and no one can see inside, and it just is what it is, and there's no way that it can be questioned, and it's not applicable to the real world. Whereas now it's turning into a glass house. It's see-through, and it's becoming more of a place where people can understand what's going on, and questions and answers are coming from within and outside of the laboratory, the glass house. And the biggest feat so far has been applying lab results to everyday life. And this brings us to the final segment of the chapter, From Mouse to Mankind. In between the second and third, Sidman went on to explain a experiment with a rat, and basically how the rat learned that if I press this button, food's going to come out. And that's what they played with. They played with the behavior of pressing the button and when the food came out and all that stuff. And that basically then ended with talking about the transition between lab results and then everyday life. How do we apply that? And there's different approaches that were discussed in completing that. You can either take it as face validity, which is highly limiting, but it is easy to do. When you use face validity, you're only using what it is the main criteria to decide if it's worth observing and measuring. And this isn't a good way to do it because it doesn't allow for generalization of that behavior, that skill. The second approach to that transition is to make it easier, is to select an arbitrary sample, and it's positive. The positive in it is that it's absent from the constraints that may make the sample of all behavior, but it'll make it applicable beyond the identified behaviors being observed, which would lead to generalization. But the issue with that is complete generalization is not attainable. With the mouse experiment that was discussed, we learned that it tested the application of the principle that consequences determine behavior. And then it leads to the follow-up question, who's the next subject? The chapter brought up using children that are institutionalized as possibly the next subject, because to try and teach them something. And that's an idea because reinforcement has been proven to be a powerful way to generate new behavior in people who are thought to be incapable of learning. That's why the institutionalized children were the next idea as a test group. And some of the conclusions that were reached were that all behavior will produce a consequence. And it kind of gave you some food for thought and saying what we do what we want based on contingencies of positive reinforcement. However, we do what we have to do, but that's because of instilled contingencies of negative reinforcement. And it also explained that a consequence is not the same thing as a punishment. And when people think of the word consequence, it is almost automatic that they mean a punishment, but that's just the coercion that's been learned and instilled in us through history of punishment. And it's time basically to try to focus on consequences that might increase desirable actions, and just remember that reinforcement contingencies can determine behavior at the end of the day. So with that, I conclude with my question to you all. It is, what is one area of your life that you can change to help minimize the usage of coercion to achieve certain behaviors? And that is all. Thank you guys very much for watching.